Hey guys, I'm Russ Still at Gold Seal. I want to ask you a question. Would your job be easier if you had better access to airspaces? I mean, these things can be confusing. You had to learn to pass them for your FAA exam, but in the real world, you actually have to apply all that airspace knowledge. As a remote pilot, you can legally fly in some places, but other places require permission. You've got all these lettered airspaces with different rules, so what do you need? A waiver? An authorization? Or nothing but a couple of fresh batteries? This issue of flying in different airspace classes remains the #1 most confusing issue for drone pilots, and that's exactly what we're going to cover here tonight. Joining me is Robert Wilhite, a remote pilot with Through the Lens Media. Robert has tons of real-world experience dealing with the complex airspace requirements around Atlanta. And before this is over, you'll understand what those requirements are and how to get access you need quickly and efficiently. So Robert, let's round up this introduction with a little bit of a background about you and Through the Lens Media.
Well, first of all, Russ, thanks for inviting me. I've been super excited about this ever since you gave me a call. You know, I came from a 30-year professional photography background.
Yeah.
So, you know, when drones came along, that was really intriguing. It was a really nice toy. And, you know, the cool thing was now I'm using my camera, but I'm using it in the air. And so all of the framing and the aperture and all of that, you know, just you take that and it's just a good parlay into the drone world. So I said, you know, drones is kind of like when the internet came along. So I'm going to kind of burn my bridges and kind of really hunker down and focus on drones. So that's when I started Through the Lens Media.
Okay, what's your website URL? Is it
throughtheLensLLC.com.
Okay, throughtheLensLLC.com. Now you've worked with a lot of different companies. Who are some of the people you've worked with in the past?
Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Discovery Channel, NBC, documentaries,
So
music videos. You know, one thing about drones is it's really touching just about every industry out there. And, you know, you can either try to do everything or really get good at something. So that's when I made the decision that because of my background, that the film and TV and entertainment industry was something that just really got my attention and is where my passion is.
Gotcha. And if you're going to be a professional drone operator working with professional clients, you really need to understand these issues about regulations, authorizations, and that kind of thing, right? They don't want any rookies.
Oh no, and you better make sure that you know what you can and what you can't do, because some clients will want to push you way above and way beyond what you're really legally able to do.
I gotcha. Well, why don't we jump in then and talk about some of the legal issues about flying drones.
Sure.
In particular, the regulation 107.41. This is Operation Certain Airspaces, and I think pretty much most people are familiar with this, but let's do a quick review of it. This is the regulation that defines which airspaces you must have ATC permission to fly in, and those include Class B, Class Charlie or Delta, and the surface area of Class E. So let's take a look at that regulation again for 107.41. No person may operate a small unmanned aircraft in Class B, C, or D airspace, and here's the clincher right here, or within the lateral boundaries of a surface area of Class E airspace designated for an airport. That's a mouthful. Unless that person has prior authorization from air traffic control. So we're going to real quickly go through each one of these, talk about each one of these airspaces. But the one that we're going to spend a little extra time on is Class E, because that's the one that really confused people. Mm-hmm. So if we look at all the airspaces, all the towered airspaces, we're all familiar with the inverted wedding cake shape for Class Bravo. Those are the big airspaces. Since we only fly up to 400 feet, we rarely will be having an issue with the bottom of the layers of the Class Bravo. The thing that we have to be concerned about is the surface area, and that's the part at the bottom or the center that actually touches the ground. That's where we have to be careful not to fly without an authorization. Class Charlie has the same kind of thing. It's got a shelf area, again, generally speaking, and there are exceptions to the rule like flying up towers, that kind of thing, but generally speaking, again, the surface area around the bottom of the central core of the Class Charlie is where we have to have an authorization. If we move on to Class Delta, the smaller towered airports generally, all they have is a surface area, so you may not fly within a Class Delta airspace without getting an authorization or waiver or some type of permission, and we're going to kind of go into those. Okay, so let's talk about Class E a little bit in more detail. Class E is shown on sectional charts by a dashed magenta outline. And here we see one, this is Rolla National. I believe this is near Kansas City. Somebody may correct me on that, but I believe this is in that area. We see a dash magenta outline outlining the airspace for this airport. The dash magenta outline designates airspace that starts at the surface. Because this surface is designated for an airport and surrounds the lateral boundaries of an airport, this is called a Class E surface area. If you're not sure about that, write it down. Class E surface area. For Class E surface areas, you must get an authorization or some type of permission from ATC to fly there. Now there's an exception to this rule about the dash magenta line. If we look at the next airport, we'll see a Class Delta airport. I believe this one is Rosecrans. And at the bottom of this, we see another little rectangle that is a dash magenta outline.
This is a good one.
Yeah, this is the one that messes people up too. That shows Class E airspace that starts at the surface. But the thing is, and if you read the regulation carefully, this is not surrounding the boundaries of an airport. So that is not called Class E surface area, that's called a Class E surface extension, and for surface extensions, no authorization required.
That's right. I mean, it's like flying in Class G airspace.
Exactly. No different whatsoever. Okay, so let's talk about quickly the difference between an authorization and a waiver. Think this confuses people a lot?
All the time. People get these two words, they actually use them intertwinably. But a waiver is actually exempting you from a specific guideline or regulation in Part 107, whereas an authorization actually allows you to operate within the guidelines.
Exactly. And 107.41 specifically says that you can fly in B, C, D, or Class E surface area.
Correct.
With authorization.
Correct.
So that's why we tend to get airspace authorizations instead of waivers. You can get a waiver for airspace, generally not done. Airspace authorizations are generally what you're looking for when you're talking about wanting to fly within a towered airport airspace or controlled airspace like that. So let's do a scenario.
Sure.
I know you've got a lot of flights around the Atlanta area. Let's kind of go back and take a look at the Class Bravo here in Atlanta and see how it's laid out. It's a big, busy airspace. You can always think of B for big. These are the biggest towered controlled airspaces in the National Airspace System. Here in Atlanta, you can see in the center there, that's the central core. That is the surface area. You may not fly inside that surface area unless you have an airspace authorization. If you're just underneath the layers there, you're okay because you can only fly up to 400, and the bottom of those layers in particular are higher than 400 feet. In your case, though, you wanted to be able to fly within the surface area, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, let's take a look at the sectional chart for Atlanta. And we've got a red outline showing the surface area. Right there in the center, we see the numbers 125 over the letters SFC. SFC stands for surface. So what this tells you is this little rounded area, it's flat on the top and bottom, but this little rounded area right in the center, the surface area, starts at the ground and goes up to 12,500 feet above mean sea level, MSL. We've got two little wings off to the side of that that start at 2,500 and extend up to the top of the airspace, which is 12,500. Now generally, if you were out underneath one of those little shelf segments, you would be well below 2,500 feet and you would not need an airspace authorization to fly there. Correct. However, if there was some reason that you had to get up that high, the FAA has included those areas in their grid system that we're going to talk about. So let's take a look at the grids. The grids are made up by a system called LANCE. The FAA has created this facility, this procedure around towered airports or also around Class E airports that defines squares, and in each square there's a number that tells you what the highest you may fly. The FAA wants you to know in advance what their expectations are. If you were to pick out some grid off to the northeast here in this chart and it said 200 feet there, the FAA wants you to know before you ever come knocking on their door that you can't fly over 200 feet in that particular grid.
Correct. So
keeping this in mind, you used a system called FAA Drone Zone. FAA Drone Zone.faa.gov, I believe, is the URL for that. This was the procedure up until more recently about getting an authorization. So how do you use Drone Zone, or how did you use it to get this Atlanta one?
Drone Zone, that's the old school way, but it's still around, and we'll talk about why it will probably be around for a lot longer. Drone Zone is the online process for you to submit your request for an authorization. It's actually very simple to do. You just follow the prompts. You want to fill out all the pertinent information, obviously. But one thing that I do suggest when you are filling out this information request is when you put in the information of, it says, okay, what are you going to fly? What type of flight operations are you going to have? Well, obviously, you don't know what you're going to be doing 6 months, a year from now. But what you do want to do is maybe put some suggestions of specific type of flights that either you have flown, not necessarily for this airspace, but for maybe other controlled airspaces that you've flown in. And with this type of specific example information that you put in there, the FAA will more than likely approve your authorization versus just putting in something really vague like, I just want to fly my drone.
Exactly. So it's kind of good to anticipate, because it's going to take you a while to get this authorization going through Drone Zone, right?
Boy, that's a source of contention.
So
if you look on the website, it says that the turnaround time is approximately 90 days. But in reality, I'll use myself as an example. As soon as I gained my remote pilot authorization or certification, I actually applied for authorizations for every controlled airspace in Georgia. I didn't want to wait till the last minute until I got a client and then, oops, I can't fly in the controlled airspace.
So you knew it was going to take you a while, so you just went ahead and got them for all of them, so you've got them available.
Oh, I heard and read the horror stories on Facebook and a lot of other online forums about, gosh, it's taken 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get my any type of responses. And my first one I received in 5.5 months, and then the remaining 7 or 8, I lost count, they all came within the following 10 days.
Okay, and I've seen your notebook. You've got a stack of these authorizations
Yes,
in there, so you've got them ready to dig out. Now, since we were talking about Atlanta, let's go ahead and look at the one that you did for Atlanta. It was kind of unusual to me because it was Drone Zone. It wasn't using Lens,
Correct.
so it wasn't physically using the grid system in order to issue you an authorization, but they made reference to the UAS facility charts, which is the grid map, in your authorization document.
Yes, it did. Altitudes in accordance with published UAS facility map. So this is, like you said, this is their version of the today's version of Lens.
It's just not automated. But the thing
Correct.
that really got me was this authorization for ATL was not just for one particular little area or lat and long. This gave you access to all of that surface
Correct.
area as long as you agreed to stay within those limits that were defined in the Lens grid system. Let's take a look at those grids for a second while we continue to talk about this.
And I tell you, another thing that really surprised me about Class Bravo for ATL was here Atlanta is the busiest airport in the world. And when I got the authorization back, I fully anticipated that they were going to direct me to be in contact with ATC prior to any flight operation that I had. But it did not specifically mention that. But I made the decision anyway to contact the tower and let them know that I was in their airspace, where I was, the AGL that I was going to be at, and the maximum time that I was going to be at that altitude. That way, in case somebody happened to see my drone somewhere in close proximity to ATL and they called the airport or they called the police, at least the tower would already know and say, hey, yes, we're aware of that. We know that they're in flight operations there. Everything is A-okay.
Smart thinking, keep your bases covered in advance.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't want to have to go, there's no reason to fight City Hall, so do everything the right way and don't get in any arguments with anybody. Okay, well, Atlanta has a lot of airports around it. We've obviously got the Hartsfield, the big Class Bravo airport. We've got, like, I believe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Class Deltas underneath the Class B airspace. Peachtree DeKalb is one of the better known ones. Mm-hmm. It's a Class Delta airspace, but honestly it's bigger, or at least has more flights. It's a busier airport than most Class Charlies. It's a very, very busy, one of the busier Class D airports in the country. So you got another authorization through Drone Zone for PDK.
Yes, I did.
So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the PDK airspace here and talk about it for a second. We've got the yellow outline in the center of the grids shows you where the airport property is, just to give you a frame of reference. And those two grids there both show 0. So the FAA is saying right off the bat, we're not going to give you anything right here over the airport property itself. It's 0. But we've got some zeros around it to the north and to the south, and then some other letters. When you got your authorization for this, was it for a particular area or a particular grid? How did this one work for PDK?
No, I actually did the same process through Drone Zone for PDK as I did with ATL. So it was through the entire airspace as long as I operated within the guidelines of the AGL grids.
Gotcha. So they sent you the authorization, the hard copy authorization that you got on this one was a little different looking. It had a page which gave you a map showing you exactly the grid system, and it's color coded too.
Yes, I did. And I was actually surprised that I didn't receive that with the ATL authorization, but I did with PDK.
Okay. So that gives us an idea on how you went through the process. You know, these were both back in 2017, I believe, when you did these. Moving on to the future and being able to use Lens made things a lot easier. Lens, as most people understand, give us the possibility of getting nearly an instant authorization. Mm-hmm. But the caveat to that is that not all airports have Lens coverage yet.
That's right. That's the reason why I mentioned earlier that Drone Zone is going to still be, Drone Zone is still around and probably will be around for a little bit longer than most people would think. But Lens, absolutely, when it came on board, when they started to roll out the different airports and different quadrants of the United States, obviously being in the Southeast, I could not wait for all the controlled airspace in my state and the surrounding states to show up on Lens. So when Lens was rolled out, the ability to get, as you said, a near an authorization in real time was actually great. I mean, talk about the time savings, talk about the hassle savings of not having to go through Drone Zone and wait for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months. And I can't tell you how many horror stories I've heard of remote pilots losing paid gigs because
we hear that all the
they
time.
didn't have the authorizations. And guess what? That happened to me as well.
And one thing we see on Facebook, I see this frequently in the groups and people's various pages. All of a sudden they get a job somewhere, Columbia, South Carolina, Bowling Green, Kentucky, I don't know, but they don't have an authorization for the airspace. So they're begging, they're asking if anybody has an airspace authorization that they can
I see it all the time.
Rent, which probably not a better, good way to look at that. So what should people be concerned about when they're operating under someone else's authorization?
Well, you have to remember that the remote pilot in control, that is the individual that takes all the risk.
And that's who the authorization
That's right. That's
for.
who the authorization is for and has been authorized to fly in that particular controlled airspace. So I don't want to put my livelihood on the line and all the hard work that it took me to get not only my remote certification, but all of my airspace authorizations. So I'm not going to just let somebody use my authorization unless I'm physically there on site, which has actually happened before.
Okay. Well, when we're dealing with Lens, then we can figure generally quick turnaround, maybe 20 minutes.
Oh, no, not 20 minutes. How about 20 seconds?
20 seconds? Okay, so much better to have that understanding. Now, Lens is an FAA protocol, really. They don't have a user interface for it other than the UAS facility maps, which are online and you can look at. You can't actually do an authorization through the FAA. You have to go through one of their industry partners.
Right.
And there's a number of companies. Some of the more popular ones, I believe, are Skyward, AirMap, and Kitty Hawk. I posed a question out in one of the Facebook groups today about what people used, and the most popular ones seem to be Skyward, and that's fine. I know you use AirMap. Have you had good results with that?
I've never had an issue with AirMap. I love it. It's super easy to use, and like I said, you've got those 3 different options, and it's whichever one that you like the best.
Yeah, there's actually more options than that, but those are some of the more popular
Right.
ones. So how does somebody get set up to use one of these apps and get moving with Lens? Do they have to pay any money? Do they have to buy an app? What do they do?
Oh no, all you have to do is just create an account.
At least in the terms of AirMap.
Absolutely. Create a free account and then, hey, you're ready to go.
Okay, so what's the procedure? Let's take a look at, let's go back to Lawrenceville, which is
Sure.
a Class Delta airport just northeast of Atlanta. That's our hometown, so that's why we're sticking to the section around here. It's another Class D airport, a busy airport just outside of metropolitan Atlanta. Gold Seal has offices there. We see the drum shape of Class D, and there's our grid map. So let's hook up the iPad here and actually see how to get an airspace authorization for Lawrenceville. We're not actually going to do the submission, I don't think, but let's go through some of the machinations here and see what we have to deal with. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, so let's put the iPad on the screen and we'll take a look at it as Robert goes through it.
Okay, I don't know if you can see there we go. So you can see Metro Atlanta, and then as you mentioned, Lawrenceville, LZU is up in the right-hand corner, top right-hand corner. So I'm just going to zoom into LZU. And as I get closer, you'll be able to see the grid. There we go. See the red lines, the 0, 200 to the left, 150. That just lets you know what the max AGL that you can fly in that particular grid. So as long as you submit your flight operations and it falls within the guidelines of that particular grid, then you're going to get an immediate authorization. So let's just choose this 200 grid to the left of the airport. So I'm going to hold my hand down, pick my spot. That's where I want to fly. I'm going to hit next. And as that comes over here, even though that was a 200, let's say I'm going to fly 150 AGL. And my flight's going to be let's say I'm going to be up there for an hour, and I want to choose my aircraft. Let's say I'm just going to fly my I-2, and no, I'm not interested in insurance. I've already got that covered. Make sure that you answer all these questions. One of the biggest things is the expected visibility at takeoff. You want to make sure that you have a minimum of 3 nautical miles, because we know that that's what Part 107 requires. I'm going to put the weight of my drone, answer all these specific questions, hit next, and then it's going to tell me that, okay, here's my flight briefing, all the basic information.
Looks strangely like a METAR, that thing people didn't want to learn for their FAA
That's actually a great way
exam.
to describe it. So I'm going to hit submit, and because I didn't choose a future flight, look here on the bottom of the screen. The authorization is already started. The flight is, so I'm already 12 seconds into it.
Well, that's interesting.
So guess what? I got an immediate authorization as soon as I hit submit, and that was less than 20 seconds.
Okay, now this brings up a question. Right now, it's 8:30 Eastern time at night. Does that authorization allow us to fly here?
Absolutely not.
Why?
Because you cannot combine a waiver in an authorization in Lance.
So you do have to have a daylight waiver to fly at night, regardless of whether you have an authorization or a waiver or not. That's a whole different subject, but a daylight waiver is a waiver that exempts you from the rule that says you can only fly during daylight hours in other words, fly at night. People sometimes call them night waivers. Daylight waiver is the official term.
Right.
I know we've got a viewer question, so let's take a look at this one. Okay, Melody, how are you doing? Melody Burgess Martin, thanks for this. She said she's glad to be here, but she's confused about the authorization for Class C within the AirMap app. Now, I don't think we need to go in and set up. I don't know of any difference between getting an authorization for a Class Charlie surface area versus the Class Delta that we were just looking at.
No.
Is there anything special about Class Charlie?
No, the process is exactly the same because AirMap already knows what that airspace is deemed as, either Bravo, Charlie, or Delta, or Echo.
Okay. Well, Melody, if you have a further question about that, maybe you're talking about something having to do with AirMap specifically, but as far as getting an airspace authorization using the grid map and using Skyward or AirMap or anything else, there shouldn't be any difference between Class Charlie surface area and a Class Delta. You can get back with us if you want us to go along a different angle on that. So at any rate, what do we get when we get our approval here? We've used Lance. In this situation, we were talking about LZU, the Class Delta here, and they approved us. what do we have to show that we have been approved?
Well, that's a great question. What you're going to get is a text message, and it's going to give you an authorization code. And that way you've got that information for your records. That way if you're approached by law enforcement or anybody, you've got that for your records that, hey, I went through Lance, I got the authorization, and here's my authorization code. So I truly am legit, and I not only am I legit, but I've got all the information, and I've met all the requirements to fly in that controlled airspace under Part 107.
Okay. Well, Melody just gave us another update on her question. Somebody
Good.
told me in my ear. She said she had a rejection on her Class C authorization and didn't know why. Obviously, we can't know why either. My guess is probably perhaps she tried to fly she requested too high an altitude, or I don't know. You have any suggestions? There's nothing between Class Charlie or Class Delta that should do it.
No, but I would venture to say that probably the most common scenario that causes you to get a rejection is either one, the grid that you chose, you may have forgot that it was 100 instead of 200. So when you put in your information for your flight, you probably had too high of an AGL indication for that process. So that's an immediate rejection. Number two, if you apply for if you apply for authorization and it's past civil twilight, and you think that there's still enough light out there to fly, so I want to go get a quick flight. If it's past civil twilight, then you will also get rejected. It's going to tell you need a daylight waiver.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting more questions coming in on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This one reads, Gary Ray says, how do you get access to fly in the zero section on a Lance map? And that's perfect because you did that at
Yes.
Lawrenceville's LZU.
Matter of fact, that's the reason why I'm sitting
That's why
here.
you're here.
4 months ago, you had a guest, and somebody posed that question. Dan,
Yeah,
I don't know. I never tried it.
Yeah, we were working with the guys at VidMuse, a very
Yes.
popular cinematic video company, and somebody asked that question, and we didn't really have a good answer for it. And Robert, you were sitting back in the control room, and you said, I did it.
That's right.
So that's why you're here tonight. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'll just give you an example of what happened to me. For LZU airspace, which is Class Delta, Gwinnett County, which we were talking about earlier, I was literally across the street from the airport in a zero grid area. And we said, you know what the heck? And I applied for, I think it was 75 feet. I was going to be in a stationary position, so therefore I wasn't going to be flying around, no airspeed required, and that my flight time was going to be 15 minutes. And we both were shocked. When we hit submit, I actually got an authorization. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, we can actually fly.
Yeah, so amazing these things occasionally do happen. We've got another friend, Soren Christensen. He's also in Atlanta, and his company is Sky Sea Video, and he told me just a few weeks back he actually got a Class Bravo zero grid approval right down there at Atlanta Hartsfield.
Yeah, it's no
pretty surprising.
Yeah, there's no rhyme or reason. I mean, obviously, by the letter of the law, Lance is not going to give you an authorization for a zero grid, but for whatever reason, it does sporadically. But, you know, hey, I'm not going to argue as long as I went through that process and I actually did get an authorization and an authorization code, then you know what? We are legal to fly that, even though that is a zero grid flying area. You've met all the requirements, and they've chosen for whatever reason to give you authorization to fly.
Okay, so zero grids do happen.
Yes, they
early
do.
on when this whole Lance
Surprisingly
facility came
enough,
out,
but they do.
I didn't think it would ever happen.
I
But
didn't
now
either.
You're real life proof, so
Yes.
that's good for people to know. Never hurts to ask. Okay, let's go ahead and take another question here. Okay, Cox Media, Hampton. I guess maybe Hampton works for Cox Media, but at any rate, thanks for joining us tonight. He or she says, I may have missed it, but where can we find the list of airports that are part of the Lance system? I don't know exactly where the list is. There is a URL for the UAS facility maps I don't know what that is off the top of my head. It's easy to find. I would suggest that you Google UAS facility maps, and you'll probably go to the FAA's facility maps. And there you've got a big map of the United States. You can zoom it in to any state or area, and you'll actually physically see them around these controlled airport airspaces. So that's one way to look. Another thing is maybe go to our Facebook group. We have a Facebook group called Part 107 Gold Seal Remote Pilots. Ask this question here. We will be happy tomorrow to even look this up for you and put it online. I don't know exactly where such a concise list would be, but look for the UAS facility charts. Do you have
It's actually embedded in the UAS page of FAA.gov. I don't know what the URL is off the top of my head, but I was actually looking at those just last week, and that's the reason why I still remember this number off the top of my head, that the last update, they added, I believe, 130 controlled airports. So it's actively going on. I mean, the FAA, obviously, they've been playing catch up since day one of this whole drone industry. And I mean, the fact that Lance is actually here and running is phenomenal. And so we got to give the FAA credit for that. So if your controlled airspace that you want to fly or that you're located in is not included in Lance today, don't give up. Hopefully it'll come in the future. But again, that's the reason why we say Drone Zone is not going away anytime soon.
Okay, so I would say that if you're in this business and you plan to be working around controlled airspace airports, you need to be familiar with using Drone Zone to get your hard copy authorizations in the case that Lance isn't available. If Lance is available, get familiar with AirMap or Skyward or one of these other products and start using the Lance system. As you've seen, it's really easy to do, and we've had some great success stories about people getting really quick submissions and approvals.
Absolutely.
Well, Robert, I think we're running out of time here, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you for being here. It's been fun.
Thank you, sir. It's been exciting.
And I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion of airspaces and authorizations. As we saw, it doesn't have to be a complicated subject. We have a lot more free coverage on this and other drone pilot topics on the Gold Seal YouTube channel, so make sure to check that out. Subscribe and make sure to hit that bell icon so that you get alerted when new videos go online. My personal thanks tonight for the guys in the control room, Ethan, Flash, Mike, and John, along with our studio guest, Michael Diaz. At Gold Seal, we've been doing online FAA pilot training for longer than anyone else. Over 100,000 pilots have passed their exams using Gold Seal training. So whether it's for your initial test or the recurrent test, you won't find a better, more enjoyable way to pass your exam than UAVgroundschool.com. Our mission is to make you successful. So fly smart and show everyone that you're a Gold Seal pilot. Good night, everyone.
Pass your Part 107 exam with Gold Seal. Take a free test drive today and see how easy it can be to pass your test with flying colors. Visit UAVgroundschool.com.